Hello, these are flipped notes 4-2 of the Unit 4 on learning, and we're diving into classical conditioning. My Bitmoji is drooling, or rather, we usually say in this unit, salivating. We're going to talk about Pavlov's famous experiment with the salivating dog and the bell. So let's get to it. I'll also do a demo of this in class. So we talked about learning in the last section, and we know it all has to do with a change in behavior, usually because of some kind of practice or experience. And then we're able to observe some kind of change in behavior. Learning can be unlearned. We can learn through observations and experience. But in this section, we're learning about how we form associations. So classical conditioning has a couple other names. It's also known as Pavlovian conditioning for Ivan Pavlov, and also stimulus-stimulus learning. So when we have two related events, the stimulus of lightning, stimulus of thunder, we form an association that when there's lightning, thunder comes after. And after many times of repetition, you know that one is associated with the other. So one stimulus, we see the lightning, can trigger a response of wincing, anticipating the thunder. So the thunder started out neutral, but eventually becomes something that we may wince to because we expect that big boom. So in classical conditioning, the big thing that's happening here is that we have something that is neutral, a neutral stimulus that didn't initially cause any kind of response, that's being paired with something that naturally does cause a response. So there's just certain stimuli that elicits or brings out a reflexive response. So for example, if you've ever been to the eye doctor, they'll do a little air puff to your eye and you blink. It's just a natural response. If somebody puffs air into your eye, you blink. When you smell food, maybe a delicious steak, that's going to make you salivate or drool. If somebody pokes you with a sharp object, you're getting a shot, you're going to feel pain. Nobody teaches you to do any of those things. They elicit reflexive responses. So in classical conditioning, that reflexive stimulus, we call it an unconditioned stimulus because it was unlearned. Conditioning is learning. So it was an unlearned stimulus, or we'll use the abbreviation UCS. And then the response to that, the reflexive response, is our unconditioned response, and we'll call it the UCR. Now, in some places you see US or UR, but I like UCS, UCR. And again, when we are saying a stimulus, anything that we respond to, the response is our reaction to that stimulus. When we say unconditioned, we mean it was naturally existing. It was unlearned. You didn't have to do anything with that. When you flinch to pain in your mouth at the dentist, no one taught you to feel that pain. You just automatically respond with that flinch. Conditioned means you've learned it. You've been taught it, even if you didn't learn it on purpose. But you learned it. You learned the value of money by working hard, by working lots of hours. You didn't just know that, you learned it. Maybe you learned it from somewhere else, but you learned it. So here we have Ivan Pavlov, who is probably one of the most famous names in psychology, but ironically, he is not a psychologist. He was a Russian physician, physiologist, who lived in the late 1800s, right around the time of the Russian Revolution. And he was actually studying digestive secretions and salivation in dogs, which he would later win the Nobel Prize for. The ideas of classical conditioning, that we could form these associations, had been around in philosophy, but Pavlov would be the one who really kind of identified and studied it and brought it to the world. Again, when we're saying classical conditioning, we're talking about forming an association between a neutral stimulus and something that was unconditioned, a natural stimulus. So Pavlov was not a psychologist, we already said that, and he wasn't really trying to do an experiment about classical conditioning. He was trying to measure how much dogs salivate when they're brought out food. And he stumbled upon classical conditioning because the dogs kept salivating before he brought out the food. So he had this device where the dogs were in a harness. He actually connected a tube to their salivary gland so he could accurately measure how much they salivated. And then there was a machine over here that kind of clicked and it measured how much saliva it created. Well, while he was doing that experiment to measure the saliva and digestion, he found that the dogs were salivating before he would even bring out the food because they would hear the machine clicking. And they knew clicking meant food was about to come out. and then they were going to eat. So they would hear the clicking, food would come out, and then they would salivate. And eventually, as soon as that machine came on, those dogs started to salivate. So he thought, well, that's strange. They're salivating and there's not even food like in their mouth. So he studied this a little bit more in depth, and he decided he was going to replace the food with a more intentional sound. Now, people always say Pavlov's dog and the bell, but in the original experiment, Pavlov actually used a tuning fork. So it made a metal banging sound, tone. That when he would ring this tone, and then he would bring out meat powder, and then the dog would salivate. He would ring the tone, bring out meat powder, the dog would salivate. And after he did this multiple times, he found eventually if he just rang the bell or hit the tuning fork, the dog would salivate, even if there was no food there, because the dog had learned to associate that when that tone rings, food is coming. So the dog had formed a learned association between something neutral, that tuning fork, and something unconditioned, which was the presence of the food. So here we have our neutral stimulus, the bell, or if we want to be more specific, a tuning fork. And initially, there's no response to that. It's neutral. When something is neutral, we don't really have a response to that. The meat powder was an unconditioned stimulus. The dog was naturally going to salivate to the food, to the smell of the food, and to the taste of the food. So by repeatedly pairing them, initially the bell would not do anything, but by pairing the bell with the food over and over, the dog started to salivate, till eventually the bell changes from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. So now it's a learned stimulus, and it's triggering a learned response. The dog is not just salivating. We'll say that the dog is salivating to the bell. It's not salivating to food and the bell. It's only salivating to the bell. So now we have a new conditioned response, a CR, this new response of salivating to a bell without the presence of food. Another way of looking at this, in the Pavlovian storyboard before conditioning, we had food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, triggers a response of salivation, which is an unconditioned response. Before conditioning, the tuning fork is neutral and it triggers no conditioned response. There's no salivation. During conditioning, so during training, we're ringing that tuning fork, we're bringing out the food, and the dog drools. Eventually, it gets to the point where now we can have a tuning fork and the dog will salivate. But we want to be specific. He's not just salivating, he's salivating to the tuning fork. So that becomes a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. So most of the time in classical conditioning, your neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. So it starts out neutral, but then it becomes a conditioned or a learned stimulus. Good. So breaking down those terms again, unconditioned stimulus, that was our UCS. It's something that automatically triggers a response. That was our meat powder or our food. Our unconditioned response, the response to the meat powder, was salivation, was unlearned. The conditioned stimulus was something that was previously neutral. That was our tuning fork or bell. And then our response to that tuning fork and bell after conditioning was salivation to the tuning fork, or our CR. So for classical conditioning to happen, first of all, you have to repeat it multiple times, so several times. And you have to make the conditioned stimulus, or what was neutral, precede the UCS. So he had to do the bell first and then the food. He found that if he did food, bell, and then try to get the dog to salivate, it didn't work that way. So you have to do the neutral thing first, then the unconditioned stimulus, and then eventually it would become the neutral would become conditioned. Let's see. So he calls this stage when the dog first learns the new behavior, which is salivating just to the tuning fork, acquisition, because he acquired a new behavior. So the stage of acquisition was when the dog would salivate to the bell. This picture is a little misleading. There shouldn't be any steak on there. But after multiple pairings here, after 10 times of pairing the bell with the steak, he eventually starts to salivate just to the bell. That is acquisition. Now, if he were to continuously ring that bell but not bring out any food, eventually the dog would say, "What's going on here?" Now, he wouldn't say it. he wouldn't actually, there's nothing conscious that's happening here. This is actually involuntary. But eventually, the association would go away. It would diminish, the diminishing of a conditioned response. And we call this extinction. This happens a lot with phobias. If you are scared by a big 18-wheeler that almost shifts into your lane, that's scary. And then for a while, every time you see an 18-wheeler, you're scared. But eventually you see 18-wheelers all the time, and if it doesn't have another bad experience, your fear goes away. That is extinction. So the learned response is gone. So he rings the bell, dog's not salivating anymore because they kept bringing it out by itself. You'd have to at least sometimes bring out the food again. Let's see, extinction refers to a loss of the response. Extinction is not the same as forgetting. The association is just gone. Now, sometimes it'll come back randomly. So for example, you're not scared of 18-wheelers anymore, and then all of a sudden you see one and you freak out again. You have a spontaneous recovery. So a spontaneous recovery is when there's a reappearance or it shows up again after a rest period of an extinguished conditioned response. So the behavior did go away, but now it came back randomly. That's a spontaneous recovery. So here there was acquisition, it went away, and then it came back later. Then it started to go away again, and then it came back again. That's a spontaneous recovery. Extinction has to happen in order for it to be considered a spontaneous recovery. We'll go much more in depth, not a whole lot more, but we'll look at a lot more examples and talk about generalization and discrimination of those conditioned responses in the next section. So that's it for flipped notes 4-2.